Oh, hey, and it just speaking of popping up, it popped up.
It popped up. Calling Chris Anderson in Windsor.
I am in. Yeah, I know. Driver Studio W1, but you are not in Chicago. Where are you?
I am not. I am in Munich, Germany on the last night of our
nice.
tour. So last week we spoke on the first night of our tour, and this is the last night of our tour.
Oh, look at that.
So now we've done all the stuff.
It went well?
It went very well. It was a wonderful group. And I have to say that because I'm sure some of them are watching. No, just kidding. Okay. But it was a wonderful group. And we had a great time. Renee was our driver. I think you've worked with Renee.
Absolutely.
He was terrific. So, and Alan Rosso was our tour manager. He was great also. So it was really good.
Good deal.
Hey, welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. And thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And look, whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH
podcast.
We're glad you're here. And today we'll be talking about burying enemy soldiers who died in your country during World War I and II. So let us know where you are. I know everybody likes to say what the weather is, so you can say the weather.
Oh, the weather. Oh, me or you?
Oh, yeah, you can say what the weather is.
It's cold as hell here.
Okay, it's hot as hell here.
Well, yeah. All right. Moving on.
Okay. Moving on, we should thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, especially our top shelf patrons listed here. And you can join this august group by clicking on patreon.com/history happy hour.
So every time I look at this, though, there was like over by Susan, there was always like that one short, we were short a name, but now that gap is opened up on the left. Is that
we added people, and so that opened the gap on the left. The next person, I'll move Ron Dries down there and fill it in.
My sense of, okay.
I think we actually did get a top shelf patron in the last week or so. I've left them out, so they're probably going to be heart-stricken. But we'll get them in, and we'll mention them by name next week.
Outstanding, and then all the rows will be in order, and I'll feel happier.
It's going to be a great week. Well, it won't be next week because we're encore next week, but in 2 weeks, it's going to be a great week for you. Great week for you. All right. Have we killed enough time?
I think probably so, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Let's give us a start here.
Oh. Well hit.
Okay.
Thank you.
I didn't hear it right away, so I wanted to make sure it was okay.
Yes.
So what's on tap?
No. Actually, it's a fascinating book this week. This week, we're joined by Professor Tim Grady, who teaches modern history at the University of Chester. He is the author of A Deadly Legacy, which was shortlisted for the Wolfson Prize and the Cuntill Prize and the German Jewish Soldiers of the First World War in History and Memory. But we're here this week to talk about his new book, Burying the Enemy, the story of those who cared for the dead in 2 world wars.
I'm trying to bring Tim on. So, okay. Yeah. Tim, welcome.
Hello. Welcome.
Yeah, hi there. Good to be here. Thanks.
Excellent. Did you bring a cocktail, Tim?
It's technically not a cocktail. It's more a beer, but, it is an alcoholic beer. It's a nice IPA.
So in History Happy Hour terms, that's a cocktail. I've got Edward 12.
Okay. And I've got Paulanerhof, so I'm drinking German.
You are. You're getting in the spirit of things.
German Pilsner. Yeah. So it's Oktoberfest here.
I could tell.
Everybody, I am the only person, I swear to God, in 20 miles who's not wearing the leather straps and the shorts. And I am wearing the shorts. I'm just not showing them.
And don't. Just don't.
All right,
with a bow tie, that wouldn't look good. All right.
Oh, maybe not. Okay.
So, getting down to brass tacks. Most books about military history, when you talk about casualties and losses and suffering, they're referring to the battlefield. And you obviously have taken sort of a different twist on this. And I'd like to know what caused you to look at the story of the burial of war dead in the way that they are. Why did you say that's something that's missing?
Yeah, well, good question to kick off with. Thanks, Chris. I think looking at death is fundamental to the history of war. And as you say, we normally look at this at the battlefield. We think about the Western Front would be a nice example, but we don't think about it at home so much. And that was my first thinking here was, well, what was going on at home? Let's try and look at the home front a bit more. And by the home front, when it came to this book, that's a home front in the UK. And I was also intrigued at looking at the home front in Germany.
Yep.
And I was trying to integrate, really, get people thinking, hang on, there was considerable death at home during both the First World War and the Second World War.
Right.
And so that was the first thing I was really interested in. But then coming on top of that, I was kind of intrigued by, it's not just people on our own side. It's not just, civilians at home who are losing their lives. It's also the enemy that are dying at home. And I don't think really don't think at all there's been a great deal of focus on the enemy. What happens to the enemy dead? And what happens to people who are dying in, like dying in Manchester or Liverpool from the other side during the two conflicts? What's happening to people or the British dying in Munich during both conflicts too? We don't talk about that. So there were many reasons why I was trying to focus on these big gaps here, because the enemy are absent and the home front in terms of death isn't really the focus of a lot of military histories, as you say, Chris. I think what I should add a little story, I suppose, in terms of where this came from. So, I mean, this was new to me, to be honest. It hadn't crossed my mind in the slightest, this. But a few years back, I was doing a bit of research near me and that, when I say near me, I'm talking about the sort of northwest of England here. That's where I'm based. And I was doing some research on a German prisoner of war camp from the First World War. And as a lot of my earlier work had been on German history, this was quite exciting for me. A German POW camp, about 30 miles away from where I live and from where I work too. And that was brilliant. German history on your doorstep. But what I discovered with this was, or what really struck me with this was, hang on, First World War German POW camp up here in the north of England. German prisoners died in it. And I was like, hang on, German military prisoners are dying on the home front in the First World War in rural Cheshire. Why don't I know about this? So there's this big absence. And I wanted to, for me, it was like, well, what happened to them? How did they die? Why did they die? Where were they buried? All these kind of questions flowed out. And to cut a long story short, I thought there's a massive research project in this, and ultimately a book. And that's where we got to.
So your book focuses on British military from World War I and World War II who were killed in Germany while it's still under German rule, and likewise German soldiers and airmen and POWs who died in Britain. So I guess the first, you've sort of answered the question of why you're interested in those. How many people are we talking about? And give us a sense, we don't have to get a case history of everybody, but give us a sense of who they are. Are they mostly airmen? Are they soldiers? What are the categories of people that fall into this group?
Yeah, sure. No, that's really important stuff to set the scene, really. I would add on to your list there civilians too, because I think they're another important category, really. But what we're dealing with is larger numbers in terms of the British who are dying in Germany compared to the Germans dying in Britain. In terms of the German dead in the UK, in the First World War, we're probably looking at about just short of 3,000 people in the First World War. And in the Second World War, it's about 4,500. So, sizable enough numbers, not massive numbers, but sizable enough numbers. If you look at it in terms of the British dying in Germany, it's probably around 6,500 in the First World War, and far higher numbers in the Second World War. Estimate of about 26, 5,000, perhaps higher.
Mm.
Okay. And then your other point then really was, what are these different categories? And I don't want to go like there's so many different categories here, but to try and break it down a bit, I suppose we've got prisoners of war being a big, substantial grouping in both conflicts. We've got, I suppose, if you like, combatant deaths, and that would be primarily airmen would be the big number here. So small numbers in the First World War, the Zeppelins over the UK that got shot down, for example, but much higher numbers in the Second World War with the air war, of course, over Britain and Germany. And that would account for, in the Second World War, the large majority of those deaths would be airmen. And then on top of that, we do have, I suppose, the civilians who die in both conflicts too. So civilians being locked up as enemy aliens and then dying in internment camps. And then I suppose we've also got, we could call them another category perhaps, particularly in the First World War. Sorry to keep going back between wars here. But in the First World War, you get a lot of people returned from the battlefield who are wounded and they're taken, say, back to the UK for hospital treatment. And they're taken to, say, captured on the Western Front, taken by train, by boat, back to the UK. And then they're put into military hospitals there and treated. And they're dying from pretty horrible wounds that they've suffered on the Western Front to their bodies. And then they're dying really from those wounds, maybe after a few days, sometimes a bit longer, once they're returned for treatment to the UK. But also, you've got British prisoners taken with really bad wounds in the First World War to Germany for treatment too, and suffering a similar fate and dying there.
So, Tim, I mean, obviously, it's kind of one of the sections of the book, but one of the things I really found fascinating is that sort of interaction between the military personnel who are dying, but the civilians that they're amongst or placed with, and that interaction. You say that the cemeteries, both in Germany and Great Britain, serve as zones of contact between people of both nations. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I like that phrase. I do like that phrase, zone of contact, and it's a phrase that's used quite a lot in very different situations in the writing of history. Really thinking about where these spaces where people end up coming together,
right.
And the cemetery for me in both conflicts is where you get the British and the Germans coming together, both during the war and after the war, or after both wars, I should add. And that's because, well, let's break that down a bit. I suppose that's because if the enemy's dying at home, both sides are left with a body,
right?
And you've got to place that body somewhere. So you're burying the body somewhere. And what happens, and I think this is the crucial point in both conflicts, is that both sides use the cemeteries that are nearest or most practical, closest to where somebody's died for these burials. And that tends to mean that actually what you end up using is local municipal cemeteries, local churchyards.
Right.
Rarely do you go out and create a brand new cemetery just for the enemy. You go, right, you've got 3 bodies here. There's a cemetery nearby. We'll put them there. And it might just be a churchyard or what have you. And that meant that you end up with the enemy buried all like in small communities, villages, towns, all over both countries. And in the book, I estimate it as possibly getting towards 750, but certainly over 700 different cemeteries in the United Kingdom that contain German bodies, German graves. And I'd say it's much higher numbers as well in Germany. And these cemeteries then become really important because you've got your local churchyard where you're your uncle, whatever's buried, your family's buried, and then suddenly mixed within here is an enemy grave or several enemy graves. And that is putting, if you like, this kind of, at least putting it on people's radar that the enemy has died and the enemy's died in their midst. And through that, we start to get zones of contact, because if there's bodies there, if there's a grave there, then that means lots of people are interested in it. And by that, I mean they're living, and they're living from both sides. I can say much more than that, but that's setting the scene, if you like.
I haven't done that in a while.
Number one.
Well, I'm muting mics to keep the sound quality up, so working on it. At least I haven't cut you off yet. It could happen. So I get the sense that we're kind of talking here. There's a phrase that I saw in a review. I don't know if you used it in the book. Referred to the politics of death. That is kind of what you're dealing with. How prepared were the governments of Great Britain and Germany, either in World War I or World War II, to deal with dead enemy combatants showing up not on some distant battlefield, but right in their backyard? I get the sense that they really kind of weren't expecting this or didn't think about dealing with it.
You're right. It was very much a kind of play by ear kind of thing. You don't go into the war. In fact, you don't go into the war entirely thinking about, well, what are we going to do if we end up with a whole group of dead Germans on our doorstep? That was not anybody's number one priority. So there are, I suppose both sides know this, in terms of the two conflicts, there's international law that needed to be respected. So the Hague Convention, later the Geneva Conventions, do have stipulations within them in terms of enemy graves, enemy bodies, enemy dead, how they should be treated. But it's very basic that they should at least be given a grave and some kind of marker. So we have that. But there was no real planning in terms of what you're actually going to do. Nobody was imagining we'll have several thousands of enemy bodies on our doorstep, or was it about, I don't know, 140, 50-ish perhaps, say Manchester German dead? What are you going to do with them? Nobody was thinking about that. And that's why you end up really with this kind of like, okay, we've now got the dead, we've now got these bodies, what are we going to do with them? And that's where the easiest solution just tends to be, okay, the local cemetery. We need to put them somewhere, so we'll bury them locally. And that's initially what really happens. It's the simplest solution, and the easiest solution is to bury these people close to where they die. And that's as far as the thinking really goes when the wars kick off both times.
So, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I want to get more into kind of the second half of the book in a bit, but it's safe to say that during wartime, emotions are running high. Particularly, I know when you read some of the propaganda of the First World War, this is, so at least in Britain anyway, there's not a lot of love for the Kaiser and his minions. What is happening when all of a sudden, Sergeant Schultz is buried in, the local Windsor Cemetery amongst all these people who just sent their sons off to the Western Front? I don't want to generalize, but what's the reaction to this kind of way these things are being done?
Yeah. I mean, it's a fair point, isn't it? Because we have the enemy and we know who the enemy is. There's a mix. There's different reactions and there's mixed reactions, and as with history, nothing's completely straightforward.
Right.
And there's different responses we find at different places and at different times. I'd say the overarching response is general acceptance of the enemy dead. And I think that's partly because, each side is very much minded about, there's this fear of the enemy, fear of what the enemy may do. But once the enemy's dead, something changes, because this enemy body is no longer a threat. This enemy body is not going to attack you. It's not going to drop bombs on you. That moment's past. And I think after that, you start to get more of a kind of emotional connection or recognition to some kind of sense of shared loss here. And I think that's what's important. And that's what does tend to come through is, hang on, this person here is somebody's, somebody's husband, somebody's son. And there is that recognition generally. And for that reason, when these enemy bodies are buried in local churchyards, generally the local priest, local communities seem to accept these burials as taking place as a necessity. Another reason for that happening, I suppose, is kind of like people are thinking, hang on, if we need to treat we need to treat this dead German, as you say, in Windsor, we need to treat him with some kind of respect, because what happens if our own son or somebody else's son from our side is killed in Germany? We're going to hope that the Germans are going to treat them properly. So there's that sense of, we treat somebody properly, they're going to treat our dead in the same way. So there's that understanding go through it the whole time. Some of those shots you've just shown there, actually, though, this is where there was controversy, because
Which one?
what happened in both wars, Second World War more towards the start, was both sides decided they'd allow funerals to take place for the enemy. So it wasn't just the case of throwing the enemy into a shallow grave somewhere or just putting them into a cemetery. Generally, they decided we'll allow some kind of ceremony to take place. We'll actually allow a funeral to take place. This was most common, I think, in terms of prisoner of war camps. So where you had several thousand men in a camp and one of their own has just died from disease or in other ways, then often the prisoners are allowed to accompany that coffin with their fellow comrade to the cemetery. And that would mean a kind of walk through a town or walk through the local area to get to the cemetery. And as we've just seen in that image there, you've got a German prisoner with a hearse being drawn by several horses through the streets of the town which the POW camp was situated in, which in this case was near Manchester. There we go. And we've got people marching behind. There's people carrying flowers as well. And they're all taking the German prisoner to the cemetery here. Now, it was these moments that sometimes could cause controversy. Mainly, I suppose, at moments of high tension. So in the First World War, when you had the Zeppelin crews, they were bombing particularly London and the southeast of England. Some of the funerals for these men, which took place similarly grand kind of setting as that one there, some people stood up, somebody even threw an egg at the coffin as it passed by, because there's this kind of horror. How can you be doing that for the people who've just been bombing us or trying to attack us? So there you got some tension. And I should just add, similarly in the Second World War, one of the first big funerals that took place was in Edinburgh in 1939 of two German airmen who'd been shot down, and they'd been flying over Edinburgh, attacking bits of it. They were shot down, and then the British, through the RAF, put on a really lavish funeral for these men. Swastikas over the coffins, marched up to the cemetery on the edge of Edinburgh, big crowds watching, flowers laid, wreaths laid, and people saying, hang on, why are we doing this? These airmen came over to attack us, and now we're giving them this big kind of send-off as though they're the big heroes. It was those moments that caused controversy, certainly, and caused some kind of chatter in the local press and in local communities, for sure.
So you talk in the book about how local communities, to a certain degree, embrace their enemy dead, connect with them in different ways. during the war.
Mm.
So what happens, and I guess we'll start with World War I. What happens after the war that kind of disrupts some of that local community connections that are being made?
So yeah, I mean, people start to connect to these dead because they're buried locally. And then I suppose the graves are there, they start to recognise the names. After the First World War, well, indeed, after both World Wars, let's be fair here, after both World Wars, once the fighting stopped, you start to get initially some quite strong contacts developing between both sides. And that's because I suppose the wartime barriers are breaking down. And that means that relatives, for example, are starting saying, well, I need to know more about my son's grave. I need to know where he is. I need to know what's happened to his body. I basically need to know that his grave's been maintained somewhere. So what happens really after the fighting stops in both world wars is you'll get a lot of letters being sent back and forth between both countries, between the bereaved, desperate for news, and local communities. Because somebody in, let's think of one example I had, somebody in Essex after the First World War really wants to know what's happened to their son, who's buried in the town of Worms, down on the Rhineland in Germany. And he thinks, well, what do? I write to local authorities and ask them for information. And writes to the local authorities in Germany, and they say, yeah, I'll go and check out the grave. I'll get back to you. We'll take a photo. We kind of want to assure you that we're looking after your son's grave, and that's okay. And we kind of understand too that you've had a horrific time. You've suffered. We've all suffered in this war, and we'll do everything we can to look after the grave. And after both wars, you get these kind of stories going back as well to both sides, really. People in Germany writing to various towns in Britain and saying, look, I know my son died near here. I know he's buried somewhere near your town. Can you reassure me as well that the grave's been cared for, it's looked after, and so on and so forth? And that's where you get these really strong contacts and bonds forming after the First World War, and indeed after the Second World War too, with local communities and the bereaved really trying to get in contact. Now, what I get to in the book is that doesn't last.
Right.
It breaks down.
Well, and I want to talk about that a little bit, Tim. I mean, I think it's interesting because you talk about two articles in the Versailles Treaty that, of course, I'd never heard of. Most people that are aware of the Versailles Treaty probably have no idea what this is. But central to this transition that you talk about in the book are Articles 225 and 226.
Mm-hmm.
So what do those articles say, and how do they impact on the story that you're telling? Why are they important?
Yeah. I mean, the when you get into the minutiae of the Versailles Treaty, it's full of lots of arcane detail. But these two articles here are really important for the war graves, but particularly for the enemy war graves, because what it stipulates and what it says in the Versailles Treaty is that whoever's territory the dead are buried on is basically responsible for those graves. So in terms of the German dead in Britain, that basically means that the British are responsible for looking after the German graves in Britain. So these, what did I say, sort of 2,700, getting on for about 3,000 German graves after the First World War in Britain, was the British that are supposed to be maintaining them, ensuring that they're tended, looked after, and so on and so forth. That's British responsibility under the Versailles Treaty. And then likewise, the Germans should be looking after the British graves over in Germany. And the stipulations of this treaty really carry on in force until after the Second World War as well. So they continue through to those bodies as well. So that sets the scenes. It really gives responsibility both sides for the other side's dead.
Okay.
The British, though, are quite happy to sort of ignore this or buy themselves out of it, really, by saying, fine, that's there, but we're going to take responsibility for our own dead in Germany. We're not going to leave you to deal with them. We're going to deal with them. The Germans, though, particularly after the First World War, are like, we don't have much money. We're broke. We're bankrupt. You can care for our dead, and we'll make sure you're doing it properly.
Yeah. So,
in both countries after the war, they make a decision. It's almost like they're marching in parallel. They decide that they're going to create a national cemetery. So the Germans are going to, I get confused as to who's making the decisions here, but essentially there's going to be a few British cemeteries in Germany, one German cemetery in Britain, and they're going to establish those. They make this decision. I guess that it's staggered. The British kind of come to this conclusion after World War I. The Germans in Britain, that doesn't happen until after World War II, I guess. But this sort of, it's a little complicated. You can hopefully sort it out for us. This concentration into national cemeteries, what kind of impact does that have?
Rick, you're totally correct here. It's very complicated. And
the one true thing I said after I got my microphone on.
It's absolutely true. And it would have been a lot easier for me in particular if they'd have followed the identical policy at the same time. It would have made the story much easier to write. I can assure you of that. But sadly, they didn't. So basically, the British come to the decision, as they do with, all their war dead, wherever they are. So at the end of the First World War, we've got all these scattered graves, and the best example being along the Western Front. So we've got scattered graves, people buried in small cemeteries or some larger ones. And the British, through the Imperial War Graves Commission, decide two things, really. One, we're not going to repatriate the dead. So the dead are going to stay in the country in which they're buried. That's the first thing. And the second thing is we're going to get rid of all these kind of mixed and scattered cemeteries, and we're going to concentrate, and they like the term concentrate, we're going to put them into concentration cemeteries, much larger cemeteries that are easier to look after and maintain. So that obviously means a process of exhuming the dead and moving all these bodies, digging them all up and moving them to larger cemeteries, which are going to be Imperial War Graves Commission cemeteries. So that's the British policy after the First World War. And the British decide they have to apply it to the British dead in Germany after the First World War. They say basically, we've got all these British buried in Germany in different cemeteries. We're going to have to move them into larger cemeteries, just as we're doing on the Western Front. And what they come to is we set up 4 big cemeteries in Germany for our First World War dead, those who died in Germany. That is massively controversial at the time because lots of people back home in the UK are like, hang on, we get your policies, but leaving them on German territory, the country we just fought against, surely you should be taking the dead out of Germany and moving them into, if you're going to move them to France or move them to the Netherlands, move them somewhere, but don't leave them there. But the Imperial War Graves Commission, as far as they're concerned, is, hang on, our policy is non-repatriation. Our policy is the dead stay in the country in which they died. If we did something special for Germany, that would destroy everything we're doing elsewhere and would break down our rules and our kind of basic principles. So they set up these 4 cemeteries in Germany, and that means they dig up all the bodies in Germany, and they're doing this, say, in the mid-1920s, and they're moving them to these 4 central cemeteries. The British do the same again after the Second World War, move all of the dead to larger cemeteries, but they add another, I think it's about another 11 into the mix after the Second World War, one of which is south of Munich, Dürnbach. The Germans, and this is where it would have been lovely if they'd all done everything at the same time. No, the Germans, the Germans are a bit late to the party, really. So after the First World War, quite happy for the British to take care of their dead in Germany. But then by the 1930s, they're thinking, particularly with a new regime leading in Germany.
Oh yeah, there was a new regime from
there was a new regime
1933-ish. Yeah.
Yeah, just about then, I think. This new, particularly under this new regime, they're looking saying, hang on, the British have these lovely cemeteries, all glistening, the nice, neat headstones, everything ordered. Yet in Britain, we've still got all these graves scattered all over. So they start to plan that they're going to set up a main concentration cemetery in Britain for the German dead. But then the Second World War happens, and it never happens. So we have to wait then until the 1960s before it finally does happen. So at that point, we get the same process that's already taken place in Germany, which is teams of grave diggers go around the country to all these 700 different cemeteries and try and hunt out the German bodies, dig them up, and move them to one concentration cemetery, which is this one here at Cannock Chase, in a rather remote part of Cannock Chase. And for those who don't know, Cannock Chase is the kind of site of special scientific interest. It's really nice kind of natural area in Staffordshire, towards, I suppose, if it's near Stafford, but towards Birmingham way. And it's there that we've got the large German military cemetery. It's finally dedicated in 1967. So it's a long, long process until the Germans get to the same stage as to what the British have been with their dead.
So I don't want to get, this might be too much of a diversion, but we've been getting a lot of questions about this from our guests. And that is, why aren't they moving the bodies? Because obviously the Americans, they give families the options of bringing their bodies home. The French, from what I understand from French historians, at first they're not going to let anybody come home, but then kind of French people start taking their loved ones home anyway, so they changed their policy. So talk a little bit about why Germany and Britain don't do that, and when you add these different versions, how that kind of complicates things, right? Because obviously you can't say, well, the French are saying we're going to bring our dead home, but the British are saying no, and that's going to present some problems.
Yeah. It's so the British and the Germans, which this is why they kind of work quite nice as kind of case studies here,
Right.
because they both end up with ultimately the same kind of policy, which is we're not going to return the bodies back home, back to the families. We're going to leave them where they are. And as you say, that's not the case really with the French. It's certainly not the case with the Americans, who give the families the choice. But it is with the British and the Germans here. So the founding principle really of the Imperial War Graves Commission, which is today's Commonwealth War Graves Commission, is, as I say, that idea of non-repatriation, and that's comes through Fabian Ware, the founder of the Imperial War Graves Commission, who's witnessing, I suppose, more richer families, people with wealth, people with influence, people with money, trying to somehow get their sons back if they've died on the Western Front, trying to get the body returned back to the UK. And his view is that there's got to be equality here. It shouldn't matter that you've got money. It shouldn't matter that you can pull the right strings and ask favours and get your loved one returned home. Everybody needs to be treated equally. So that's the basic principle here: is we treat everyone equally. And we're going to do that by leaving the bodies in the countries in which people have died. And we're going to provide everybody who's died with a headstone. And it's going to be the same style of headstone for everyone, so that we've got equality. So we've got parity. So there's no difference here in these cemeteries. All have a uniform design is the idea. Now, the Germans, I think they kind of fall into the same policy, mainly because they don't have the money to do much else after the First World War.
Right.
So they kind of say to families, look, in the end, they say to families, you know what, you can return the bodies if you want, but you're going to have to pay for it. You're going to have to work out the transport. You're going to have to fill in the paperwork. It becomes almost impossible for these families to do this.
Right.
So in the case of the UK, I think what I found is a handful of cases where a few bodies are taken back to Germany, and I mean a handful, like 3, 4,
Yeah.
5 after World War One, just because these families have been persistent and they've had the financial resource to do that, but nobody else has returned. So in both cases, you've got this rather unique situation here of non-repatriation. The bodies are going to stay, and that's where the complications then come, and that's where the politics come, and that's where the local relations come, because the bodies are still there, and you're still dealing with the enemy years and years after the war has ended. Both wars have ended.
One of the things that I found interesting in your book is that both the Imperial War Graves Commission, now the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and the German VDK, the German equivalent, they both sort of take the opportunity to operate quietly, to not tell people exactly what they're doing, right? And I assume that this policy is because they are fearful that an angry mother, father, family member, et cetera, is going to upset the apple cart. But they're pretty secretive organizations, especially, in the years shortly after the war when they're moving bodies around and everything, right?
Yeah. I certainly think so myself. Obviously, families have a big attachment to the dead, and the families, they have their own ideas what's going to happen to the bodies and what's going to happen to their son's body. And what a family decides might be different to what the VDK or the Imperial War Graves Commission decide after the First World War. And that's a problem. That's a problem for the Imperial War Graves Commission in particular, which is the first one that's really making this firm decision that the dead aren't going to be returned. So after the First World War, the Imperial War Graves Commission has to battle through to get its principles accepted. And indeed, throughout the 1920s, even into the 1930s, there's campaigns from families saying, we totally disagree with what you're doing and we want our dead returned from France, from Belgium, from wherever. That's our son. We want the grave back. You shouldn't be deciding for us what's going to happen. So this is a really tricky, these are really tricky politics that the Imperial War Graves Commission has got to navigate here. And it does so slightly, not placing its cards on the table, I'd say, straight away. It's keeping its cards close to its chest. So for a while, it keeps open the idea that, okay, all the bodies will stay in France, Belgium, but maybe we'll be able to change them from Germany. So the British that died in Germany, there might be a chance we'll let you we move the bodies from there. But in the end, as I say, what the problem comes about where they're saying is, the Imperial War Graves Commission basically decides, if we were to remove bodies from Germany and move them across the border into France or what have you, if we were to do that for them, then people whose dead are buried in France would be saying, well, why can't we move ours? So in the end, they decide we just can't do anything. The bodies are going to have to stay in Germany. We'll just have to move them to a new cemetery. And as far as the War Graves Commission decides is, look, we know eventually then what's best for the families, and we'd like to present to them these finished cemeteries, and they're going to be beautiful, which they certainly are, and say to the families, look, here you go. We've created this really perfect cemetery. It's going to be neatly cared for. Your son's grave will be there. Now accept it, if you like. That's the way it is. the Germans after World War II, when eventually they do start to be allowed to move their bodies, which is early 60s, they're also similarly doing it a little bit like, we'd like to present you the finished article, which is this new cemetery on Cannock Chase, rather than the families getting in the way beforehand and saying, hang on, I didn't say you could move my son's grave, or, you know, my husband's grave, I was happy where my husband's grave was. They'd rather just do the movement of the bodies and then say, look, it's all done and dusted. Now, there you go. It's almost like a present for you, if you like.
So to what, I mean, kind of going throughout this book, though, I mean, you talk about, you know, when this all starts and these dead are buried in disparate cemeteries, and you talk about the process of gathering them up, and we read about this, and, you know, this is all happening because it's the right thing to do, or, you know, there are lots of reasons. But one of the things that you talk about that I don't think enough people really think about is, you call it mortuary diplomacy, but there's a political element to all this too, right? So what role are these cemeteries and this interaction playing politically? I mean, you have a story where you have a bunch of veterans of the War of 1870, you know, attending a funeral for an Irishman, Bernard Murphy, who's serving in the Royal Irish Regiment. And you say that there's other reasons for them being there, whether they know it or not. But so what are those other reasons? What's the other part of all this?
So, yeah, well, it's a good question. So there's a really good book called The Work of the Dead by Thomas Lacour. And that book talks about the power of bodies. And I think that's what comes through here. There's a politics to these bodies. There's a certain politics to the enemy dead in particular. So that example there you give, I think that's First World War example. And that's the politics going on there is that if we treat and we show respect to this fallen soldier, for this enemy soldier who's died in Germany, then hopefully the same respect would be dealt to our German soldiers who die in Britain. So that's the initial politics. But then it's politics all the way through, because after, if we take the 1920s in Britain, for example, as the British and Germans there starts to get reconciliation, start to try and move out of the First World War, the enemy graves provide a really nice way of doing that. Because again, if you're treating these graves properly, if you're having, you know, if you're laying wreaths on them during remembrance ceremonies, if you're treating them with respect in November each year in the UK, well, then you're saying to the other side, look, you know, we want to build out of the conflict. And for that reason, in the 1920s, sometimes German diplomats are invited to remembrance ceremonies in Britain. There's a really nice example in Birmingham, where an annual remembrance ceremony develops in Birmingham, in Lodge Hill Cemetery, I think it is. There's British graves and there's German graves in this cemetery. And the members of the German embassy are invited up, where they're there to lay wreaths on the British graves and on the German graves. It's a sign of coming together. And that only happens because the other side's graves are in the same cemetery. It brings people together. And that's that kind of diplomacy that takes place. We get similar events going on in Germany as well, where after the conflicts is like, hang on, how do we connect? How do we rebuild relations with the other side? There's graves here. We can use those as a way to come closer. Because once again, you know, if we're showing respect, if we're showing understanding, then we're making those connections. We're showing that we respect your dead in the same way that we respect our own dead, basically.
I want to come back to these cemeteries that Britain and Germany created, because I certainly never knew that there was multiple British cemeteries in Germany. I never knew that there was a German cemetery in Britain. I mean, do these cemeteries get the attention that you think they deserve? And I'm just going to add into this my personal experience. I mean, and I've been to a lot of cemeteries, so I would think of myself as somebody who knows a little bit about where cemeteries are. And certainly I've been to some U.S. cemeteries in France that are very lightly attended with visits that probably get fewer people in a year than they do in Normandy in a day. It's always struck me as sad. But do you think that these cemeteries now in England and in Germany, where the dead are buried, that they're getting the attention they deserve?
I mean, that's a really good question. I've wandered around, I think, almost all the British cemeteries in Germany at one point or another. And I think very rarely have I found anybody else in the cemetery the same time I've been in them. So they're certainly not the centre of attention. And when you go through the visitor book, sometimes you can look back, because the British ones have, as you know, you've got the visitor book in them, in the Commonwealth War Graves ones. Sometimes you can go back days before somebody else has left a name or a remark in the visitor book. The same with the Cannock Chase German cemetery in the UK. I don't think there's the times I've been around there. I think it's rare to have seen anyone. And I suppose one of the points I was trying to make in the book really is that when the graves were scattered, they seemed to get far more attention than they do now. And they got far more attention because it was kind of a unique case that you had 2 or 3 Germans in your cemetery, or 2 or 3 British in your cemetery in Germany. And that sort of put the spotlight on that small number of dead. But when they're in a bigger concentration cemetery where you've got, several thousand graves in a single cemetery, I think perhaps the individual stories are lost. The focus on individual lives disappears somewhat as well. And also the fact that there's a bit more of a disconnect then between how those individuals actually died and where they died. Because somebody might have died 100 miles away, 200 miles away from where they're now buried. So those local stories have vanished then. People don't know why that body's there or how that person died. Whereas when they were buried locally, people knew that. There was some kind of connection, some kind of understanding. And I'd say that's kind of faded away. This might also be the passage of time as well. We've obviously moved on much further from the world wars.
So one of the things, another thing that I found really interesting was the VDK, because I knew a little bit about the organization, but not as much as obviously you do, and I know now from reading your book. But the VDK started after the First World War. It's certainly not as an organization, perhaps, but members become deeply involved with the National Socialist regime. But somehow they were able to kind of pass through that and come out the other side, and they're active today. So can you maybe talk a little bit about what happens to the organization during the war, and then what part they play in sort of the post-war politics, right?
Yeah, they're a really interesting organisation. They're a product, again, of the First World War, like the Imperial War Graves Commission was, or today's Commonwealth War Graves Commission, formed just after the First World War. But they have a less well-defined role than the Commonwealth War Graves Commission ends up having. They're more of a, as you say, membership organisation. They're more of a voluntary organisation, and they're reliant very much on funds coming from their membership to keep them going. Because in the German case, there's a breakdown between official organisation responsible just for managing, curating and cataloguing the kind of dead. Then the VDK comes along and sort of promises that it will fill the gap and beautify the cemeteries and make the cemeteries nice. And that's what it starts doing after the First World War. It says we'll be the organisation to make sure the graves are looking good, make sure they get better headstones, make sure these cemeteries perhaps almost look a bit more like the British ones. Now, they managed to fall in with the Nazi regime in the 1930s. Pretty much the same personnel in charge of it, running through, and then they have obviously a new group of dead to deal with during the Second World War. After the Second World War, they remarkably, do they denazify themselves? They remarkably come out the other
Yeah,
side.
that's what I mean. Yeah.
And that's partly because they're a group that is also regionally based. So they have regional branches and regional strongholds. So if you look at the British zone of occupation after World War II, the British are looking for somebody who can help them out and take care of some of these graves on their doorstep. The VDK just happens to be there and says, we can do this. So the British go, oh, great, let's work with the VDK. The Peel War Graves Commission are also saying, we've worked with the VDK before during the 1920s and 1930s. Let's start working with them again. And it just sort of kicks on again. And they just sort of find themselves in the right place and manage to, if you like, take control of the German dead. And then during the 50s, they're starting to build up their power base. They're starting to reassert themselves. And they do this really well. And they start to be the driver to the new West German government saying, look, let's start to sort out the German graves in North Africa. We can help you with that. And as treaties then are signed between the West Germans and Libya, Tunisia, and wherever else, the VDK's on hand to say, we'll design the cemeteries, we'll get these sorted. And then they start doing the same really across Europe as well, and signing all these different treaties that then give the VDK control of the German bodies, and they start to sort out the cemeteries. And that's eventually what happens in Britain as well with the one on Cannock Chase. That it's a VDK design cemetery under a treaty that's signed between the West Germans.
Oh, wrong one.
The West Germans and the British government, and there we have it.
Because you said but you say that as an organization, they're kind of part of the rehabilitation of Germany.
Yeah, exactly. It's about rehabilitating Germany, and really that's in terms of the cemeteries they're constructing in the 50s, and this one's in the 60s. It's almost saying, look, hang on, you lost people in the Second World War and the First World War. We lost people too. So we want a normal cemetery, just as you've got, because our soldiers died fighting a normal war, just as your soldiers did. We're one of you, basically. So let's ignore the messiness of what the people are up to.
Right.
Just ignore what was going on. We're just, it was a normal war with normal deaths, and we're going to look after them. And as an example of that, there's some pretty unsavory characters buried in Cannock Chase, which point out the fact that this wasn't a normal war, and these weren't really normal burials all the time. Like there's some SS graves in Cannock Chase, or there's some Ukrainians as well who were serving in that direction too.
Yeah.
Also buried on Cannock Chase. So there's a whole mix of people there, and it's very clearly not an ordinary cemetery in many respects. You've got refugees in there as well who fled the Nazi regime, buried on Cannock Chase. So it's strange history there.
I'm afraid we have to. We could keep going for another 40 minutes, I'm sure, but I think we have to wrap this up. And we've been talking today with Tim Grady, who is the author of Burying the Enemy: The Story of Those Who Cared for the Dead in Two World Wars. Tim, thank you so much for writing this book. And I've got I've got a couple of cemeteries I've added to my list that I have to visit. Right. So appreciate that. And thank you for joining us today on History Happy Hour.
Thanks so much.
Okay. So Chris, next week,
yes,
we have an encore episode. We haven't decided what encore episode. We can't tell people what it is. We have our crack crew of encore episode planners is hard at work.
That department, that's what we're doing.
They're sharpening their pencils. They're getting down to the plan, and we'll probably once I get home, I'll figure it out and put it up on the website. But not ready to do it tonight. So keep an eye. Keep an eye for your email. Check out HHH, and then the following week. We will have Lawrence Rees on to talk
Yes.
about his book, The Nazi Mind, 12 Warnings from History.
Yeah, you definitely want to tune in for that. It's got a lot of attention over here, and it's a really incredible book. So
yeah, so that's what's coming up. Thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
thanks, everybody. Stay safe.